Ladies and gentlemen, I would, as always, like to very warmly welcome you here to the Churchill Auditorium for the second evening of the Swiss Institute for International Studies. These are, without question, enormously turbulent times, which is also, of course, reflected always in our programs, which you know very well. Therefore, the quest for competent and convincing speakers is absolutely quintessential. In other words, we would like to extend a particularly warm welcome to tonight's guest, Professor Stephan Bierling. Dear Stephan Bierling, a very warm welcome. It's great that you made it here to Zurich. Be welcome here. Give Professor Bierling a huge hand. Ladies and gentlemen, last weekend, as you all know, millions of Americans took to the streets in protest. The demonstration had a single target, the 45th and the 47th President of the United States of America, Donald John Trump. This was a clear statement against the policies and the style of President Trump. To what extent was this demonstration justified? To what extent is Donald Trump exploiting his office? What is the agenda behind both his domestic policy and, of particular interest to us Europeans, his foreign policy with all its global implications? Our speaker will address these questions tonight under the title, you can read it above, 1 year of Trump 2, consequences for the United States, the world, and Europe. Needless to say, the topic, as dramatic as it is, involves an infinite number of issues, ultimately also, and especially with regard to Putin's Russia, war and peace in today's world. Our speaker, Stephan Bierling, is one of the foremost experts on American politics and contemporary American history. He has written important books of these topics, which are widely read and eagerly discussed. 5 years ago, he published the book, America First, Donald Trump im Weißen Haus, with the subtitle Eine Bilanz. Another important work has been published this year in its already third edition, Die Unvereinigten Staaten, das politische System der USA und die Zukunft der Demokratie. Stephan Bierling is Professor of International Politics and Transatlantic Relations at the University of Regensburg, and he also publishes articles in numerous high-quality media outlets such as the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, an excellent choice, by the way, on both sides. Why do we speak English tonight? Because English is still the global language, and hopefully it remains so. And we also have a small chance that the White House is listening. Dear Professor Bierling, again, very warm welcome. The floor is yours.
It has been almost a year that Donald Trump won a second term for President of the United States, and it has been exactly to the day almost 9 months that he re-entered the White House. And I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but for me it feels like 9 years already. In these 9 months, he has done more damage to transatlantic relations, to the international economy, and especially to American democracy than any other president in the 236-year history of the United States. Let me just remind you of what has happened in the past 9 months. And if you want to take a look at the first picture, high up on top, that was when he sent his Vice President, J.D. Vance, to the Munich Security Conference. And I took this picture myself because I stood about 10 meters from him. And he gave a speech which at the Munich Security Conference was unheard of. Usually this is a love fest for the transatlantic community. And he more or less declared the American-European partnership over. He even went farther. He said the Europeans are a danger to free speech and to democracy. And that was only the beginning of what we experienced over the next couple of weeks. A couple of days later, Trump met, and we do this clockwise in the pictures, with Zelensky in the Oval Office, and he treated him so brutally as no visitor to the Oval Office has ever been treated in the history of the United States. This was not enough. A couple of days later, on February 24th, the anniversary of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, the General Assembly of the United Nations usually takes a vote to condemn this Russian invasion. And most states vote, of course, against this invasion. A couple of them abstain, but the countries that actually support Russia in that can be counted on the fingers of one hand. There are countries like North Korea, Belarus, Syria under Assad. And this time you can see it up there. The Russians got the vote of the United States, got the vote of the American president. This was unheard of. For the longest period, we only thought in Europe that the worst thing that can happen to us in transatlantic relations is that the Americans lose interest. Now, Trump had moved into the camp of the enemy. And then, and I don't have to elaborate on that, he started his trade wars. You in Switzerland know more about it than almost anybody else. But basically no country was safe of his wrath. And he introduced tariffs at 100%, 50%. We never knew exactly how high they were because they changed so often. And not only in international affairs, he proved to be a disaster for stable transatlantic relations and stable international economics. He also sent the National Guard in democratically governed cities in the United States, and he obviously wants to make people get used to the view of soldiers in the street. He fights Jerome Powell, the independent head of the American Central Bank, which you can immediately see when the dollar goes up or down or gold rises again. Something of the holy principles of the American financial architecture is the independence of the Fed. And again, internationally, he met with Putin. He rolled out, literally, the red carpet for him in Alaska. Even though this meeting led to nothing, he is still of the opinion that he can deal with Putin and can bring him in from the cold to find some kind of compromise in Ukraine. And then he's attacking the press. The media that seemed resistant, the last bastion almost against the ideas of Trump to control America as almost an autocratic ruler, they have bowed in many respects to him. He sued them for billions of dollars, the New York Times and other outlets, and he has moved the entire political debate more or less to the social media sphere, which he, over X and through Truth Social, pretty much dominates. I didn't have time because I had to send this in 10 days ago to put a picture on top on the peace process in the Middle East. That would have made my analysis a little more positive, because that's probably the biggest thing Trump has achieved, not only in these 9 months in office, but during his entire time in the White House. But we can discuss this later on in the Q&A session. Trump is willingly tearing apart this liberal international order that has all given us, at least speaking for the boomer generation like me, so much peace, stability, freedom, and wealth as no other generation in the history of mankind has really been able to enjoy. He has thrown us, as this cover of The Economist shows us, into an age of chaos, which is not only due to him, but he is increasing the chaos in international affairs and especially within the West. I want to discuss in the following 35 minutes, which Martin Mayer in his endless generosity has allotted to me for my talk, 4 questions. The first question is, why is Trump tearing apart this world? Why is he trying to destroy this liberal international order, which not only us Europeans, but also the Americans brought so much peace and prosperity? What drives him really? Who benefits from this is the second question I want to discuss with you. Then we look at what does this all mean for Europe, and in the end, that will be my longest point, we'll talk about how we can respond to it as Europeans, and I'll have a special focus on Germany, which is, again, the most important player in Europe. Before I do that, I want to cordially thank you for this nice invitation to be here and to talk to you, all of you to come out for the nice introduction. I won't be using the pulpit, because the pulpit is only for the big animals, like Churchill and Martin Mayer, but I'm a down-to-earth guy, so I'd like to have both feet on the ground. So I hope this is okay with you. I'm small fry, these are the big elephants in the room. I will base my discussion on the 2 books Martin Mayer was so kind to mention earlier. That is a book on the first Trump administration, and what we see now is a more radical, a more brutal version of what Trump tried to achieve in the first administration, and my latest book where I dig a little deeper and look at the questions, how was Trump possible? What went wrong in the political system of the United States that made him a real option for president of the United States? It's party polarization. That's the big problem of the United States, and Trump is profiting from it, to give away the punchline of my book already. First question, why does Trump try to destroy the international order? Short answer, because he can. He is the president of the most important economic power on the globe. He is the president by far of the most important military power in the world. And everything he does has real consequences for all the countries on this globe. If we were talking about the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, or allow me to say that, the President of Switzerland, we might be amused about the shenanigans that we experience from Trump on a daily basis. But this has really real consequences. Trump's whims, his ideas, his gut feelings are a determining factor of international and national policies. So whatever Trump does becomes a problem, or in a few instances, a benefit for the international arena. The second thing you have to always keep in mind, and that's the reason why I show you this map, and you might not, if you're not hail from the United States, be used to it. It shows a different view of the world, with America being in the middle, If you watch German television, of course, and Swiss television, always Europe sits in the middle in the evening news. Vremya, if you watch in Moscow, of course, Russia is in the middle. But this tells you a lot about the mindset of America and also the possibilities America has in international politics, because it has such a privileged geographic position on the globe as no other great power does. It's covered, shielded, protected by two huge oceans, and it has two lovely, because they're weak, neighbors in the north and the south. So America, as the only nation on the globe, has never to worry about being invaded by huge land armies or being conquered by another power. The Americans are the hegemonic power in their own region. This is a huge advantage. They don't have to worry about things European countries have to worry about constantly. Ask the poor Ukrainians. If the Germans don't invade from the west, the Russians invade from the east. So your location is absolutely central for the options you have in international politics. This makes clear why Trump can actually freely choose where he engages in international politics. The Middle East is as far away as is the Far East. Japan, China, Germany, and Europe is as far away as South America. So this gives the American leading politicians a lot more options. They are not forced to focus on a certain point in the international landscape. They can choose freely, and this, of course, makes it possible to talk about isolationism, because America is simply less dependent on the world as all other countries on this globe. Look at even China, 14 neighbors. Look at Russia, 14 neighbors. Germany, 9 neighbors, and most of them we invaded at some point. That means, that creates an environment where the Americans don't have to be necessarily internationally engaged. And that creates, of course, a mindset of a big island covered by these two Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and they can freely choose where to engage. This is the first structural element, and we political scientists love to talk about structures. We'll talk about people also later. The second thing is that this upheaval we are experiencing in world politics has not started with Donald Trump. The era of Western domination that was so prominent in the 1990s and in the 2000s and even a little bit in the 2010s, this period is over. Back then, we were the only game in town. Democracy, market economy, also militarily, we were the dominant player on the globe. This has been changing over the past 15 years. It has been changing mainly by the military build-up and the new aggression by Russia and by the economic rise of China. And was looked for a very long time that these two countries would play along our rules has changed dramatically. With their new power, they do not want to be longer rule takers, Western rule takers. They want to be rule makers. And I think that was covered quite nicely by the cartoonist. And you see the cartoon actually came out about 4 or 5 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. The two big powers tried to get all the pieces on the chessboard in their many arms. The octopus wants to create a world by collecting supporters, by collecting countries, by collecting pieces. And for a very long time, it looked like we in the West, here embodied by this image of the American Uncle Sam, were more or less seen as onlookers. We were not on this playing field. So this order, this liberal order, had already started to get weaker and to be attacked before Trump even got into the White House. But he increased these tendencies. He made stability even less possible through his erratic and confusing decisions in the Oval Office. Why does Trump do that? There's one little theory that he is more or less controlled by the Kremlin. You might have read about it. There is this idea that there exists compromising material in a file that Putin has, and whenever anything goes to seem to go against his will, he, with Trump, reminds him that there might be some things that he might bring into the open if the American president doesn't play along. And to some degree, it seems quite convincing, because at many occasions, Trump talks like Putin. Just 2 quotes up here. Zelensky is a dictator. Ukraine started this war. That is one-on-one out of the playbook of the Kremlin. We haven't found any proof about that, about the compromat. Journalists have looked into it. Academics have looked into it. We don't have any proof. So I can discard that for the further discussion, because we want to be in the world of the reality and facts that I can actually prove. And I don't even need to go into this direction to explain to you how Trump makes and decides his policies. I've talked about structures. Now, as a political scientist, I have to also talk about people, and Martin Meyer announced that already, that Donald Trump is the spider in the international web. American foreign policy has usually had a lot of different players. Congress with its committees, the foreign ministry, the Department of Defense. Nowadays, everything obeys the will and the wishes of Donald Trump. So whatever comes into his head, or more likely into his gut, or what he has seen in Fox News in the morning, will immediately be a decisive factor of what Trump decides this very day. Trump is driven by very few instincts. One is he has the idea that he is omnipotent. That is something that I've experienced with politicians quite a lot, but never to the degree as with Trump. And he has a lust for revenge in his second term in office. He feels mistreated, he feels persecuted, and he wants to take it out domestically on his enemies, but also on the international level. And he wants to play with the big guys. This is one of the reasons why he can't really get a good connection with any statesmen from democratic countries. They are bound to norms and to constitutions and to coalition treaties and so on. This makes quick decision makings, quick deals, not possible, because it has to go through parliament, it has to be ratified, and so on. Trump wants quick decisions. And therefore, his mindset is more the mindset of Putin and Xi Jinping. And it's not for nothing that he sees these two people almost as his idols. Putin he adores publicly in speeches. He declares him almost the biggest politician, the greatest politician he has ever encountered. And Xi Jinping, despite all the confrontation that's going on in the tariff field, he also admires for holding such a tight grip over China. And he wants to sit, and I think this is very nicely covered by the cartoonist, at the table with the big guys when the world is redistributed or distributed anew. What Putin does in Ukraine, what Xi does in Taiwan, he wants to have part of it. So when he talks about annexing Greenland or making Canada the 51st state of the United States or regaining the Panama Canal, we can say that's empty talk. But it fits nicely into his worldview, and you never know with Donald Trump when empty talk becomes harsh reality. So we have to always keep in mind it's Trump's ideas of how this world should work that dominates American foreign policy more than any president's ideas have ever dominated American foreign policy. Second question, who wins? Who benefits from that? And I think I can save a minute if you just look at this cartoon, because it tells the entire story I could lay out to you in 20 minutes. Of course, Putin wins, because Putin is not interested in a liberal order. Putin is not interested in transatlantic cooperation. For 70 years, the Kremlin has tried, starting under Stalin, to separate the Americans from the Europeans, because as long as we stick together militarily and economically, the influence of Russia, of Moscow, on Western Europe will be quite small. But if he succeeds in actually splitting us apart, he can pick country after country without being in danger of America intervening. The best symbol of this transatlantic security relationship, of course, is NATO. And what Trump does, he delivers, and it's nicely put here on the cartoon, on a silver plate, the existence of NATO to Putin. That is something every ruler in the Kremlin has tried to achieve for the past 70 years, and Trump gives it to him for free, almost. He's not talking about anymore leaving NATO or calling NATO obsolete, but the doubt is there. And would anybody guarantee me that the Americans would actually come to the rescue if Russian troops invaded Narva in Estonia? Probably not. With Trump, the first impetus would be, what's in for me? Would you, Putin, maybe look the other way if I took Greenland? Then you can have Narva and Estonia. And he would say, historically, it was always yours. That's the typical Trump argument. So this is something the people in the Kremlin are celebrating. And they're celebrating not in also in the literal sense. When Trump was elected in 2016 for the first time, they had Krim champagne served in the Duma. And I'm sure they did the same thing in the Kremlin when Trump was re-elected on November 5th of last year. It's a dream come true for the Russians. And the second person who profits enormously from it is Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is a catastrophe for China. His economic policies are pretty poor. He has not made many friends over the past 10 years. The economic performance of China has been weak over the past years. The demographic situation is a pure catastrophe, but he's being saved by Trump. Because with his tariff policy, Trump drives country after country closer. I don't want to say into the arms of China yet, but closer to China. Look at what the Brazilians do. Look what happened when Trump introduced high tariffs in Southeast Asia, in countries like Vietnam, who have moved over the past generation closer and closer to the Americans because they are so afraid of China. Xi Jinping, who basically never leaves China, immediately traveled to Vietnam, immediately traveled to Laos and Cambodia, and told these countries, look at us, we guarantee you stability. We won't introduce unjust tariffs on you. And this is, of course, an attractive promise. So Trump is the best hope for the Chinese that actually there will be a Chinese 21st century. He is also delivering it not on the silver plate, but step by step to the Chinese. Third question. What does this all mean for us in Europe? For us in Europe, as this wonderful picture of my beloved Economist says, the other great newspaper next to Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Martin, it's our worst nightmare. that Putin and Trump sit together and decide European problems. Ukraine, for example, is our worst nightmare. In the Cold War, we called this bilateralism, when the Russians and the Americans worked together on European issues, especially in nuclear defense and so on. We always wanted to have a seat at the table. What did Trump do as one of his first moves after entering the Oval Office? He called for this peace conference between Russia and America over the fate of Ukraine. And neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans were invited to sit at this table. And this conference didn't even take place in Europe anymore. Usually in the 90s or in the Cold War, you would have said that would be a natural conference that would take place in Helsinki or in Geneva. This time it took place in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. So the power is moving away from Europe, and Trump and Putin are kind of conspiring to decide European affairs over the head of the Europeans. It hasn't gone full circle yet, but this danger is looming. And it meets a Europe that is astonishingly weak, even economically. We Europeans always claim that economically we look eye to eye with the Americans. We are a huge economic power. That was true 2008 to 2010, when we were actually on the same level as the United States. What you see here is the share of the three big economic players at the world domestic product. Of all goods and services produced around the globe, the Americans are still number one, even with an increasing trend. Since 2010, since the big economic financial crisis hit us all around the globe, America has prospered much more than the Europeans. They have overtaken us. They are now a third bigger economy-wise than all the European economies. That puts us in a position of weakness that Trump can smell. If he can do one thing, he smells weakness in his opponents, but also in nations. And he uses this as a lever to suppress other countries or to make them yield to his ideas. The big story, of course, and I haven't even mentioned that, of the past 30 years is the rise of China. Never in the history of mankind has a country risen as fast as China over the past 30 years, but they are kind of leveling out at the moment. You see, they're at about the same level as the European Union, and for a long time we thought, they would at some point overtake, probably in the 2030s, even the United States. Now it looks different. Because of the poor economic performance of China in the past years under Xi Jinping, the Americans will probably never be caught by China economy-wise. They will get a little closer, but they, from the 2050s on, will fall back behind the Americans, mainly for demographic reasons. The picture gets much worse when we look at the field of security. What these columns, they are adjusted for inflation and also exchange rates, show you is the entire spending of the West for military matters. And in 2014, you see the dark black column, that's what the Americans spent. They spent about 3 times more than the Europeans for defense. The picture is brightened a little in 2024. They spend about double what we spend in Europe. But that is really something that we have to take in our calculations. The Americans have not only spent more on defense, they have also amassed much more tanks and capabilities and frigates and so on than we have in Europe. The picture gets even darker if you look at how the Germans and the Europeans spend their monies on defense. We spend it on many different great weapon systems. 180 great weapon systems we produce in Europe, the Americans only produce 30. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist or a professional economist to understand, if you spend so much money on so many different types of weapons, you get a lot less bang for the buck. The unit costs will be much higher if you only build a limited number of your tanks. The Americans, for example, have just one tank. You can see it, it's the Abrams tank. That's the only tank they built, in different versions, of course. But of course, you can build this much more efficiently than the Europeans, who built 17 different types of tanks. So we not only spend a lot less money than the United States for our defense, we also spend it for egoistical nationalist reasons very inefficiently. How do we get out? And that's my final point, which takes a little longer. And you remind me immediately, Martin, sure, when I'm over time. Sure. Because there's no clock I could see. No, it's all fine. It's all fine. Good. 4 options I want to lay out in front of you that we have in Europe. And of course, the option I advocate will be option number 4 for dramatic reasons. But the first option is hope for the best. We are great in Europe, doing nothing and hoping for the best. And it worked out from time to time, because the Americans were there, they took care of everything. You remember the Yugoslav wars, the Europeans said that's the hour of Europe, we send in a few blue helmets and everything will be resolved within weeks. It took 5 years, and 100,000 deaths later, the American cavalry came in and resolved a typically European crisis in the Balkans. So waiting seemed to be an option, especially during Trump's first term. And it worked out quite nicely, you know. Trump was very energetic in his first term, but he was unprepared, he was erratic, and most of all, he had a group of advisors around him in the cabinet, in the White House, which belonged to the Republican establishment, and which more or less took care that his worst instincts didn't become policy. I could give you one example for that if Martin gives me an extra minute.
Yes, agreed.
Thank you. I forced him into that. You remember in the first term when Trump introduced high tariffs for South Korea, a stellar ally. You shouldn't ruin your relationship with such an ally over tariffs. Trump said we'll introduce 35% tariffs. So that this can become actual policy, I'll let you in how this works in the White House. The president has to sign a so-called presidential direction directive, a presidential decision directive. Only when he has signed it, it can really filter into the bureaucracy and become American foreign policy. Now, this lay on his table, the Resolute desk, it's called, in the Oval Office, and Trump was about to sit down to sign that. But he had an economic advisor coming from Wall Street, Cohen was his name, and he was not very fond of this idea. So what he did was he took this piece of paper, covered it under his jacket, took it outside of the Oval Office, tear it apart, and it was never heard about it again. Now, in terms of how democracy should work, this is highly problematic. You would agree. But in terms how foreign relations should be saved, this was a very smart move. Cohen did this. He was not rehired in the second administration, of course. But there were grown-ups in the room when something seemed to go awfully wrong. He had a lot of generals in his cabinet, Mattis as defense secretary, his national security advisor, McMaster was a general, and they were bound to keep Trump in check, and they mostly achieved it. So at the end of the 4 years, American foreign policy was kind of acceptable for most Europeans. He hadn't done what he had announced, mainly because of these people from the Republican establishment in the room who didn't want to ruin transatlantic relations. So our strategy worked out in the end, the European strategy: do nothing, wait him out, will be one term, will never return. That is a fluke of history, we'll be best friends after Trump again. Now, it didn't work out that well. After 4 years, he came back, and he came roaring back. More decisive, more radical, more scrupulous, more brutal. And what we see now is Trump as Trump wants to be. Unchecked, unbound by anybody in the White House or the cabinet. So this time, I would argue, we have no option. We cannot wait. Because, as I told you in the beginning, it's just only 9 months that he has been in office. We have 3 years and 3 months ahead of us. And at this speed, it might be disastrous for us in Europe. So, not an option to wait. Second option, and now you might call me crazy, why don't we throw in our lot as Europeans with Putin? This was German foreign policy for a very long time. And the argument that I often hear, we have learned our lesson after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we will never fall for the Russians again, and so on and so forth. I don't quite buy that. At least it's an option that's actively discussed in European and also in German circles. I don't want to have to go back to Schröder here, arms in arms with Putin, the biggest embarrassment in German foreign policy since 1949. Still, unser president, still in power, was best friends with Lavrov. And on the left wing of the SPD, Herr Stegner, might even be known here in Switzerland. You know him, of course. He just traveled to Azerbaijan to meet representatives of Putin to talk about peace, without any information given to his party or to the Bundestag. And he's not a normal parliamentarian in the German parliament. He is a member of the committee that oversees the intelligence agencies. For him to travel, as he called it, in a private way to a corrupt country as Azerbaijan and there meet Putin's envoys is close to what we in Germany call Landesverrat, treason. And this, of course, is supported by parties in Germany. Take the AfD in Germany, take the Linke, take the Wagenknecht-Partei. They are always all Putin's poodles. They talk like Putin would be able to bring peace to Ukraine, that he is misunderstood, like they've learned nothing from the past years. And to make it more dramatic, look at the election results at our elections in early 2025 amongst the 18 to 24-year-olds. The Linke, the AfD, and the Wagenknecht Party, they together gathered 52% of the vote. So there is obviously a strong movement in Germany that cannot be translated in pro-Putinism one-to-one, but still that these parties gain so much at the polls doesn't really make me feel very secure that that is not a venue the Germans might take to rearrange their affairs with Putin. And on the European level, you have Putin's puppets sitting not only in Hungary, but also in France, where Le Pen is not in power yet, but her party was more or less financed by the Kremlin, by a bank very close to Putin, and many of the leading figures of the Le Pen party have been also paid by Russia Today, this propaganda outlet of Russian state media. So there is a certain danger. And if you look at what happened in Slovakia at the last elections, what happened in the Czech Republic at the last elections, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but still it is an option that is not entirely off the table. Of course, it would mean the end of European ability to decide above their own fate, because this would be decided in all big matters, of course, in the Kremlin. So, for me, not a good option. Third option, what about China? China looks a little friendlier. It rolls out the red carpet for the Europeans. It talks nicely, also at Davos, that they are the new guarantors of the international order. So that sounds nicely, and especially since it's coupled with the fact that Brussels and Beijing are 8,000 kilometers apart. So we don't have to expect what we can expect from Putin, attacks with artillery and invading armies. That's not in the card with the Chinese. But they invade Europe in a different way. And I don't even mean by goods and things like that. They have already conquered parts of Europe ideologically. Look at what was possible in 2007, when the Dalai Lama was received by Merkel and by Sarkozy and in Downing Street number 10, and the Chinese responded, because they see the Dalai Lama as terrorist, with harsh economic measures. And since then, no European country had the guts anymore to receive the Dalai Lama in their chancellery or in their presidential office. This is what you have to expect if you go into bed with the Chinese. Also, second example, the European Commission every year issues a huge survey about the state of human rights around the globe. And of course, it usually sees China quite critically because of the treatment of the Uyghurs. You have heard about the Uyghurs probably, a Muslim minority of about 15 million people in the westernmost part of China, in the province of Xinjiang. And the Chinese see them collectively as terrorists. And they've started to put them in concentration camps. Forced abortions, forced sterilizations. That is the reality there. The Chinese call it educational facilities. When the European Commission writes down these facts, they are pretty much proven. It goes to the Council of Ministers, where each country, of course, has the ability to veto this report. And who do you think puts in a veto, has been putting in a veto for the last years? The Hungarians, of course, because they have huge immigration and also investment of the Chinese in their country, and the Greeks. Of course, because they bought the port of Piraeus. So that would be the future. If you go into bed with the Chinese, they would nibble away your independent values. They would make you, try to make you into pantsers of the Chinese. You couldn't allow yourself to vote against Chinese interests in the General Assembly of the United Nations. That would be our future. Not a future I'm really willing to accept. So third option is a no from my side. Final option. And I'm in my final stretch. The only option that we have, a guy you might remember here on the placard by the name of Churchill proposed this at this very place some almost 80 years ago. The only option is that we revive Europe, that we strengthen Europe militarily, because that's the most important part at the moment, but also economically. I call for a NATO 2.0. NATO 1.0 was NATO where the United States defended the Europeans. NATO was more or less the American guarantee for the survival of Europe with military means. This time is pretty much over. Now we have to take our fate in the own hands, and that means 4 things that I want to explain to you at the end. It means, first and most of all, political leadership, because that's one facet of American transatlantic cooperation, that it was the Americans that in NATO usually called the shots. They provided leadership, whereas all other European nations couldn't make up their minds. My students who work nowadays for NATO say when the NATO ambassadors or the defense ministers or the heads of state come together, everybody waits what the Americans have to say. Then they can adjust their own positions to what the Americans want. This time is over. The Americans don't come to many of these meetings anymore or send 3rd or 4th tier people there. So this must be replaced through a cooperation of Europeans. And that can be the European Union, and that can be all the members of NATO. It will be boiling down to a coalition of the willing and the able. And the 5 nations that have this in their hands, I have presented here to you. It's the Brits, it's the Ukrainians, the French, it's the Poles and the Germans. They have to work together to make this new Europe without American leadership manageable. All right, this picture was taken on May 10th. Since then, the fate of 4 of these leaders has been damaged dramatically. Starmer has an approval rate of 16%. Zelensky fights the Russians with his back to the wall and without American support. Macron, I don't have to explain, pure disaster. Tusk lost the election for the presidency, went to the Peace Party. So it boils down more or less. That's a hard lesson for the Swiss in the room, to the Germans. Not only because we are the biggest and the financially strongest country, we are the only ones that are financially capable of doing things in Europe. All other great nations, like the Brits, like the French, they are in debt over their heads. So it boils down to the Germans whether they want to spend their monies to bring this Europe together and do what is necessary. And the first thing that is necessary is that we get militarily the upper hand again. I don't want to read this all to you because you've heard it, and I don't want to read where we have dramatic problems in providing military equipment, but it will boil down to the German, more or less, to buy this stuff either from the United States or from any other country that can provide military hardware, maybe even the South Koreans and the Japanese. And we have to beef up our military. We have simply too few boots on the ground as Europeans. It doesn't make any sense to put so much money, hundreds of billions, into buying new tanks and to new artillery and so on, and then not have the people that can actually service these things. You see the German numbers of our troops went down in the past 20, 35 years from 550,000 to 180,000. That's far too few. And the Germans so far, even under this more outspoken government, have really ducked the question whether they want to reintroduce the draft. It doesn't go without it, and this, I think, is a fact. Look simply at the numbers of the Russians. They can muster 1.3 million people. Ukraine has 900,000 soldiers under arms. And I'm really at the end of my presentation now. A very decisive question, if not the decisive question, is what happens to Ukraine. It's not only the fate of this democracy, it's not only the fate of this country that lies on the table, it's our fate as well. Because if Putin wins, And what winning means, Lavrov has just pointed out to Rubio in a telephone call 2 days ago, it means the sovereignty of Ukraine will end to exist. He said it's still a fascist regime and we won't talk with Zelensky. So if Ukraine falls, that will not be only a dramatic disaster for the Ukrainians, also for us in the West, because we were weighed and proved too light to actually come up with what is necessary to keep Ukraine alive. And this is being monitored by many countries around the globe. The Indians, the South Africans, the Brazilians, they look at the situation, and if they see that Putin wins with his naked aggression, they won't in the future side with the losers that are too weak to actually support a fellow democracy. They will side, of course, with the winners. This is something that is at stake now. And I can't spare you the worst part of all, because we can do a lot on our own in Europe. That's just a matter of will and money. But what we cannot replace in the short run is the nuclear umbrella of the Americans. That will take, even if we wanted to do it, not only decades, but generations. It will cost hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. You see the sheer numbers. The British nuclear forces are too weak to support the Europeans to come up with a nuclear umbrella that could replace the Americans. So we have only one option for the foreseeable future. We have, like in a wrestling match, to get to the Americans and do everything to not leave us. Even if it means, like students, high school students, to sit around in the Oval Office and to listen to your professor that tells you how the world works. This is something the weak have to endure, and this is the new age that we have entered. An age about which Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War 2,500 years ago has already written, in times like these, the strong do what they want, the weak ones endure what they must. This could be the end of the talk, but that would be a little too sober and too bleak. I give you, in my final 90 seconds, an idea why I'm still optimistic. First of all, you didn't throw any eggs or bottles at me. Probably because you forgot to bring them, but I'll take this as a good sign. Because what I've told you over the past 35 minutes, I've been telling to my students and others for 10 years. And usually the reaction was quite hostile when I'm talking to public audiences, because they thought it would go on forever in this wonderful world of eternal peace where the Americans took care of everything, where we could do our business and so on. So the public has really woken up, and you are the best example. That you came out in such numbers on such an important topic shows that you won't go back to sleep after this discussion. You are the elite. You are the multipliers of such ideas. You in your circles have to actually and actively engage these topics. And that, I think, is one big progress. The second big progress I see in the media. The Neue Zürcher has always said that we live in a dangerous world and that we shouldn't be carried away by our dreams. But now even the mainstream media have more or less understood that. Even the politicians, I would argue, are much sobered up by what they have experienced over the couple of years. But what gives me the most hope is my students. Because never in my 40 years, tells you how old I am, and how faked this picture was of me when you walked into it. You thought you were a young man talking to you. My students, I've never had so many students that are so engaged, so realistic, so motivated, that tackle the problems of our times in such an energetic way as in the moment. We boomers, speaking for myself, might have blown it. We probably not handing down them the world as we have handed it down by our parents. We had generations of wealth and prosperity and peace. This is not something we are handing down to the next generation, but they understand it. And they know that fighting for your liberty, fighting for your democracy is something that's a task that will determine their lives and the outcome of how they will be living in the futures, and also their children and their grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Wir müssen nach oben gehen. Absolutely brilliant, Stephan. Thank you so much. And of course, you know, here we have all the representatives of the avant-garde of enlightenment, and it's absolutely so that most of our friends here share your analysis. It's also good that you ended with some hopes, what could be done, and something really has to be done if we don't want to go the way of the later Roman Empire described by Edward Gibbon. So Stephan and I are in total accordance, so we don't discuss with each other, but you now have plenty of opportunities to ask questions, and I have one back for you. We switch between German and English. You also can address your questions in German, and we make a cosmopolitan mix. But the question should be concentrated short, and Stephan will answer concentratedly shortly. Okay, please.
Thank you very much, Professor. You've made a very compelling case that Trump is a catastrophe. Yet the US is winning economically, militarily, and many other dimensions. In Europe, we have politicians that are well-educated, well-versed, very colloquial, yet Europe is losing. Do you see a type of Trump leadership as a potential also solution for Europe or not?
It's a trick question, but you don't get me that easily. First of all, Trump is not the solution to the American problems. He's the accelerator of American problems. And the Americans will find out what high tariffs and other measures of Trump's, like cutting off immigration, will actually do to them, or curtailing freedom of speech at universities and so on. That's the biggest asset the United States ever had, and which is so important in the 21st century, that we are in a competition for the brightest minds on the globe. And Trump shutting them out is the most stupid thing anybody has ever heard of, and Xi Jinping and Putin must be rolling over about Trump's stupidity. So that's at the basis. So the solution for Europe would not be a Le Pen or a Orban being the strong man, because they would cause the same catastrophe strongmen usually cause to their nations economically and politically. The solution can only be enlightened leadership. And this is something we can demand from our politicians, and they work for us. So what they don't do right, we probably have then elected the wrong politicians. So it falls back on us that we find more, I would also say, charismatic leaders, leaders that are willing to also take risks. In Germany, Merz talks the right talk in many respects, but he doesn't walk the walk, because, of course, he's in a coalition government and so on and so forth. But the solution can never be to bow to the authoritarians. That is a recipe not only for democracy, but also, I would say, for economic progress, a disaster.
Okay, next questions, please. Here.
Was I short enough?
Wonderful.
You touched very briefly on the why, and you said, well, who benefits from it? And you said Russia and China benefit. But the question is, Trump and his own family have benefited from liberal democracy. All the Republicans who support him, the oligarchs of America, they all exist because of liberal democracies. And these are not stupid people. How can they not see that moving in this direction that Trump is moving them is against their own best interests?
Thank you so much. First of all, German professors always like to say, first of all. That's some German thing. I simply try to get it out of my body, but it doesn't really go away. So first of all, you're absolutely right. Trump is the biggest self-enrichment machine for him and his family in the history of the American democracy. What he does always includes enrichment for somebody who is close to him. Now, some players, economic players, want to be on the winning side with Trump. And some of them bow to him, as do all the tech oligarchs, for example, because they want to get the most favorable condition for their operations. That they give up their democratic convictions, if they ever had any, like Bezos with the Washington Post and so on. That's obviously the price they are willing to pay. You have to also keep in mind, if you look at Trump's inner circle, these are people who would never have made it into these high-ranking positions under normal conditions. They are third- and fourth-rate people, most of them, with a few exceptions. Rubio, for example, and Bessent, they are first-rate people. But most people would have never made it even to the door of the White House. But since Trump doesn't know any types, and he only wants to have sycophants around him, excludes, of course, all independent thinkers, which he had to rely upon still, as I pointed out in his first term. This time, he has only people from the media, Hegseth, the worst Secretary of War, we now have to say, in recent history. No qualifications whatsoever. The Secretary, the Attorney General, worst person ever, simply an instrument of Trump's revenge impulses. These people know that their entire existence and political career depends on the thumbs up of Trump. And if he puts the thumb down, their career is over. So these are people that surround him. And like you, I would say, I'm amazed how important people in the media, in the field of economy, but to some degree also judges, people of whom you would think they have some backbone, and they are, the crown of democracy. They have bowed to Trump. And this I find on a personal level pretty much the most disappointing thing. Trump understands people better than I do. And he knows how flat their instincts are. They know how greedy they are. He knows what they would do to get into a realm of power. And he toys with that.
Next question, please. Over there, and then you.
You talked about NATO 2.0 under the lead of Germany, and my question is...
Under collective leadership.
Yeah. Is this really a reasonable proposal when the right-wing extremism in Germany rises in the face of the AfD? Or differently stated, what makes you sure that this military power in the European power will not be misused by fascists?
Now, nothing makes me sure of anything. I'm talking about the future, and the future is open. I can be totally wrong, but there is the TINA factor in international politics. You have probably heard about the TINA factor. There is no alternative. What else, if not collective European leadership with a lot of German money? Can things go wrong? Can, in the next elections, France go Le Pen? Yes. It will be a dramatic problem. Can Germany go into a coalition of the Linke, the AfD, and the Wagenknecht-Partei? It's possible. But then it's the end of days, you know. And I am not willing to accept this fate quite yet, because we can fight it. The future is open. I just give you an idea what it's worth fighting for. Thank you.
Another one there, and then over there, and then here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interfere with your
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, there you are.
Yes, I just want to ask another question, whether you like Trump or not, but what is your analysis of the American political landscape? Why has the Democratic Party of the first 4 years of Trump not come with a better candidate than one with a clearly, deteriorating mindset? And second, then they came up with a candidate that wasn't even approved by the Democratic Party in a democratic process. I mean, what's going on, right? They used to have two parties, but one party kind of disintegrated more or less. So what's your diagnosis on that?
Do I get 60 minutes, Martin?
Go ahead.
Now, first thing, you're absolutely right. Trump's strength, to some degree, is the Democrats' weakness. Now, Biden beat Trump. He was the only one who ever beat Trump. But what he should have done, and I think that's obviously to anybody, after 2 years he should have declared he's not running again. I would take issue with your argument that Harris was not democratically elected, because there were representatives, they were democratically elected, that elected Harris to run against Biden. But this was a process, of course, that was not really laid out in a longer election strategy, because everything went hopla hop. And that was, of course, problematic. She probably would have never received the nomination of the Democratic Party. She blew it in 2020 when she actually wanted to win and had to drop out after a few cycles. So she was probably not the best person. But it was the legacy also of Biden's, mainly the huge wave of immigration in the southern border, which Biden couldn't control and which was, in the end, the decisive factor for Trump's return to the White House. You have to keep in mind, it was such a close election. 1.5 percentage points Trump, in the end, was ahead of Harris, which you can also argue was quite a success for Harris, because Biden, at some point, if you polled him, was 10 points or so behind Trump. But this is still a problem for the Democrats. I just had an interview with your Tagesanzeiger. Do you consider that a competition of the Neue Zürcher? Not
No,
really, okay?
They are wonderful colleagues.
Okay. Look at his face. And there I thought up an idea what is really the problem for the Democrats. Namely, they have been too successful over the past century. If you were a Democrat in the Roosevelt administration coming into power in 1933, what would you have dreamed of? Social security, health care, abolishment of segregation, and so on and so forth. So the Democrats were extremely successful in developing an agenda that over 90 years has become the center of American politics. Nobody wants to do away with Social Security anymore, Rentenversicherung. Nobody wants to do away with the earned income tax credit anymore, subsidies for poor people. Nobody wants to do away with Medicaid, Krankenversicherung, health care for older people, or Medicare for the other way around, for poor people. So the American system is a very democratic, liberal system nowadays. But that means the Democrats at the moment are running out of big topics. And this is always a problem in politics, because then smaller topics, put rightly, like immigration, like who are we as a nation, they come to the fore. And that gives Trump, not the Republicans in general, the upper hand in many debates. So what the Democrats have to come up with, and last time it didn't work, was the topic of we are the saviors of democracy against Trump. And obviously this didn't fly. We will protect the abortion rights of women in the United States. That was obviously not important enough to elect Harris to the presidency. So they have to find new topics. And this is very difficult because Trump is ideologically not pure. He is a combination of the best things of Democratic campaigns and Republican campaigns. Anti-immigration comes originally from the unions in the Democratic Party. High tariffs was something the Democrats demanded, not the Republicans. He even doesn't want to do away with Obamacare anymore, which was still a big target in his first administration, because he sees that's quite popular. So it's very difficult to really pin Trump down, because he changes position so quickly. He has an extremely excellent feeling for moods in the population. And we live in a post-content society almost, where it doesn't really count anymore what your political position is. It's more, is this guy strong enough to take care of my tribe? It's very tribal, this policy, and Trump is masterful in that. Last idea, what can the Democrats do? I would advise them, and that's somebody speaking from the pulpit and from his papers, what he has analyzed, it might turn out differently. But first of all, they have to find a candidate who is sellable in the Midwest, which Kamala Harris wasn't. She hailed from California. That's something the Americans won't go for. So Gavin Newsom, governor of California, forget your candidacy, would be the end for the Democrats, at least in the next elections. Go for somebody who has shown that he can reach across the aisle in these swing states, these 7 swing states in the United States that decide the next election in the United States for president. Look at Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. Look at Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. Maybe even look at some other governors from this area. They might be much more sellable to the wider American public than a Kamala Harris or a Gavin Newsom. A very short final thought. Maybe what I've said is totally unimportant. That might also be possible. Why? Because you have in the United States just 8% of what we call Wechselwähler, independent voters that change their vote from election to election. 8% out of 100%. That sounds like Germany in the 1970s, where we also had only Stammwähler who elected the same party time over and time over. Now, these people don't care a lot about big policies. Why? Because otherwise they would have made up their minds whether they are pro or against Trump. They are open for many things, and they are easily disappointed. And these are the people who threw the election in 2016 for Trump against Hillary Clinton and the legacy of Obama, who threw the election for Biden in 2020, who rethrew the election to Trump in 2024, and they are already annoyed and disappointed by Trump's especially economic performance. They don't like tariffs, they don't like it that the prices are going up, and so on. So I'm quite sure next time they will elect somebody from the Democratic Party, because it's the only alternative. Maybe they don't have to do anything. As long as they don't put up, a absolute lefty, they might be fine. That's not big political analysis, but maybe the reality is sometimes simpler than we political scientists make them publicly appear.
Okay, one last question, Enrique.
You can have my water, but the microphone is coming here.
Stephan will be back for another session, so we have to finish for now.
Professor Bierling, I apologize already in advance for my question, but please don't take it personal that I probably challenge almost everything you said except the characterization of Donald Trump. But talking, I can't really believe that what you present me here, which represents, for me, a bit a one-sided transatlantic view, how Europe and everybody should behave towards Russia's aggression. And please don't misunderstand me. I condemn fully the aggression towards Ukraine and the suffering of Ukrainians. And I would never want to live under a Chinese system, and I would never want to live under a Russian system. But nowadays, I'm not even sure if I want to live under the US system when I see, and I fully sympathize with these 7 million people who demonstrated last weekend. But on the other hand, I honestly can't believe that an academic like you would promote and convince us here in this room to follow your advice to fall back into the Cold War and to waste our resources, our already minimal resources, into the military-industrial complex. And if I wouldn't, that my question is, how do you want to convince us to really, why should we really throw our resources in a threat which is not really present? And everybody who knows how long it takes to build up a system like you presented knows it's absolutely an illusion. So I ask you, why do you represent this position of going back to Cold War? And don't you think we have arrived in the 2025 that we should actually go into peace and discussion and try to find a solution underneath?
Many thanks for your question. I don't think it's my decision, but it's the actions of the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans that support Russia and the Iranians that support Russia with Shahid drones. That doesn't leave us an option. The weak ones will be overrun by military strongmen like Putin. That's the experience we have to draw from what is happening on the ground, what we see happening in Ukraine, what we might see in Taiwan, what we might see in the Baltic states. So security policy, of course, only makes sense if we think in worst-case scenarios. If we think in best-case scenarios, we wouldn't need any weapons, because then through rational dialogue and diplomacy, we would always end up at compromise without being in need of using any weapons. But this is something we can do in the European Union, because in the European Union, and I count in the Swiss, the idea that the Swiss army attacks Bavaria or that the Germans invade France, which we did quite often, nowadays is absolutely unthinkable. So this thinking is a major advancement in the history of mankind, but we created it ourselves, and it was also helped and created by the support of the United States, who always were there as the protector. I would say it's wrong to take this lesson that civilized politicians can sit around a table and hammer out compromises even at 3 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning, as we do in the European Union, and it's wonderful this way. And in the end, of course, the Germans pay the bill, which is also okay. But this world doesn't exist outside the European Union. I would be entirely on your side if we were all European Union members on the globe and we would behave in these structures that we have created, and somebody would take care that we're not being attacked from the outside. But this is not the reality outside the borders of the European Union. Go to the Balkans, go to the Caucasus, go to Eastern Europe. This is cruel, brutal politics. And if you want to, as a politician, and that's your most important obligation, guarantee the security of the people and the existence of your state, you sometimes have to do it with means that deter the aggressor from attacking you. And this is the entire story. Had Ukraine, final sentences, possessed nuclear weapons, which they had in 1990 as inheritance from the Soviet Empire, would Putin really have dared to attack them? If they had been a member of NATO, would Putin have really dared to attack them? These are the questions we have to ask, and not whether the money that is being put into armament goes to waste. Yes, in a certain respect, it's waste, but in a certain sense, it guarantees the peace. It's the peace dividend we have to pay so that we can come together in a peaceful environment in Switzerland.
For instance, and not thinking constantly about being attacked from bad neighbors, like the Ukrainians have to do, like the Baltics have to do, like the Poles are facing every day. And this sobers up your thinking. So I would argue my final sentences. When you think about international security and safety, you cannot count out the military side. Everything starts with the military side, because you have to change the calculations of the bad guys out there. And this you don't do by holding hands. Sorry. One personal remark to this discussion, and Enrique knows my position very well. There is an old saying, si vis pacem para bellum, if you want peace, prepare for war. There is appeasement, and what appeasement can bring, we all know from history. And there are some very, very bad, ugly guys in the world who try to threaten us with all means. If we don't fight against them, we are lost. So, now, a short forecast for our next performances. This is a live stream from the Swiss Re studio in Rüschlikon with Keir Giles. He's an explainer of Russia, Enrique. That would be also a very interesting lesson again. He knows everything about it, and it gives us a lot of insight. Can you put that back quickly? Yeah. So this is a live stream. You can watch it on your devices, and you also can ask questions on your devices, but it's at the studio of Swiss Re, so this is not open. Go on, please. Jimmy Wales. Ha! Economist, and he invented Wikipedia. Is that right, Frau Sura? Everybody who is in Wikipedia is immortal. So you go there too, and he will give you some very interesting insights about his concept, his business, and yeah, he's an icon. Then on Wednesday, 19th of November, we have our State Secretary, Alexandre Fasel, a good friend. He was also here once, and he's the second man besides Ignacio Cassis. There will be some serious questions about the policy of the Freisinnige Partei of Switzerland regarding, oh no, I don't continue now. This is quite a difficult topic. And then, of course, Robert Habeck, I don't have to introduce him, will also be very, very interesting. And you have to be early there that you get a seat. Finally, 2 evenings in the cooperation with the Literaturhaus. Irina Rastadorova, author and translator, about the horrible things which happen in Ukraine, and it's always good to have first insight. We had Sergei Shadan here when he talked about his country and how it's bleeding, how it's terrorized by the Russians. And then Dr. Simva Samar, also very interesting personality. She wrote a book. She is a doctor in Afghanistan, or was a doctor in Afghanistan, and had to leave this absolutely horrible condition. So it's all really straight to the point. Now, dear Stephan, comes the worst. Normally, there is a tradition, or is always a tradition, to give you a gift. A fitting gift, hopefully, and we had torches, and we had water pistols, and we had chocolate, and we had liquor, and we had books, and fantastic things. So, but this is now really a symbolic one, and rightly so. I don't have to unwrap it, because I wear it right now. It's a tie. And the pochoir. And what is on the tie? You see it here. A flamingo. And you know what the flamingo means for Ukraine. And whenever we put this tie, we are in defense of Ukraine and this hopefully wonderful weapon, again, to fight the orcs. So, dear Stephan, next time you wear it, and this is a standing invitation. Thank you very much.